Welcome to the Birmingham Medical News Ask the Doctor podcast. I'm Steve Spencer, founder of Birmingham Medical News. We do this in partnership with Kassouf & Company. Kassouf & Company is an accounting firm that's been in Birmingham for almost 100 years. They do accounting. They also have an advisory service. They do wealth management. They have a healthcare advisory division that's very, very well respected. So we're thankful to Kassouf, and we're also thankful to Dr. Emily Russo. She is the sponsor of today's podcast. She is the owner of Russo Pediatric Dentistry. Now, Dr. Russo grew up in Birmingham. She went to UAB, University of Alabama at Birmingham, where she studied dentistry, and she went on to specialize in pediatric dentistry. She completed her residency in pediatric dentistry at the University of Southern California, came back to Birmingham, and she just recently opened a practice in Homewood. She is also on the staff at Children's of Alabama Surgical Services. And Dr. Russo works with children of all ages, and she's also set up to work with special needs children. And I asked Dr. Russo what motivated her to get into dentistry. And she explained that she had a whole lot of dental work done as a child herself. She had fillings, crowns, root canal, extraction, a little bit of everything. And in her words, she said she'll never do any dental work on a child that wasn't done on her. I've talked to her a while, really empathetic, so I'd highly recommend her. With that, we'll get on with our podcast. So our guest today is Dr. David Kimberlin. He is the co-director of Pediatric Infectious Diseases at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and Children's Hospital of Birmingham. And today he's going to talk with us about infectious diseases from the post-pandemic period to where we are now. So, Dr. Kimberlin, it's great to have you. And I guess let's start with that original idea. I know you were very, very, very out there during the pandemic giving people advice on how to stay safe. But tell us a little bit about how infectious diseases have evolved from pre-pandemic to where we are now.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you and your listeners and viewers today. It really is a privilege to be able to talk about infections and hopefully, build on some of the benefits, if you can believe there were any, to the pandemic. In other words, things that we've learned as a world, as a society, and be able to use those to protect ourselves going forward. I think if you look back, well, it seems like eons ago, doesn't it? In terms of something that happened pre-pandemic, it's like it was a dividing line for us. There was a before and there was an after, and there was this horrible middle in the middle of it all too. But really, if you think back pre-2020, because the pandemic really just started to become into our consciousness and to be able to spread at the very, very end of 2019, if you think pre-2020, we were really in quite good shape in the world. We had measles on the run, we had polio almost eliminated. Certainly, smallpox has already been eliminated. We were looking at end game strategies for some of the scourges that have devastated humanity for millennia. Then the pandemic hit. And so, it'd been 100 years since we'd had a pandemic of that magnitude. It'd been 50 years or so since we had any kind of pandemic of any magnitude. There was a 2009, 2010 H1N1 influenza pandemic, but that thankfully didn't kind of gain much steam. So what we were looking at that point in time was a scenario that we'd read about, some fantastic books about the old 1917, influenza pandemic and so forth, the Spanish flu. Historical kind of records, but not something we'd experienced as a people, as a culture. And I think we did a lot of things right with the pandemic, and I think, be honest with you, I think we did a lot of things wrong with the pandemic. We were figuring it out as we went. I think the catchphrase at the time was, "You're building the airplane as you're trying to fly it," and that's just the nature of what we had. That's how we had to deal with it. And I think as I say, it went pretty well. I think people became very informed on how viruses spread, respiratory viruses in this case. We heard terminology that we had not heard before, like R naught, how many people get infected from any one particular case. I think there was a lot of frustration that we didn't know more faster, and I understand that. Although I think I'd ask for some grace in terms of this virus had never been seen in humanity before, and therefore we were learning as we went. But ultimately, as it dragged on, and looking back, 3 years was not an unexpected duration of time with that pandemic. Same thing had happened with the Spanish flu pandemic in the late 19-teens. But I think many of us really thought it would just be done. Maybe not by Easter, but it wouldn't be 3 years, and in fact it dragged out to 3 years. Now we had a fantastic rollout of the vaccine. I still remember the euphoria of those days, of those moments, and they probably will be things I'll never experience again. And I guess because I never want a pandemic like that to hit us again. I hope nobody experiences it again. But it really was a release. It was a collective, we can see the end kind of thing.
I remember myself, yeah.
But with that also came a lot of people who were distrustful. And they some of the wind in the sails that movement caught had pre-existed. We'd had vaccine deniers for a few decades, but it really accelerated. And so as we moved out of the pandemic, thankfully, COVID is much less of a threat to us now. It's still out there. It still causes a lot of disease, but the virus has mutated. It's become less virulent, and most importantly, we as a world have a lot of immunity to it. Because it spreads so easily, a lot of that immunity is wild type immunity. It's to actually having been infected. But we have these very safe and very effective vaccines that also, allow us to protect ourselves. And I'll pause here and recommend that everyone hearing this or seeing this podcast get their COVID vaccine, which is now available in pharmacies and doctors' offices. The new version that's designed to attack the most recently circulating strains of COVID. That's the best way to protect yourself. So as we came out of that, we saw the COVID threat recede somewhat. But as feared, some of the older viruses, things that we've had vaccines to prevent for decades, they've reemerged. And some of these are very, very infectious viruses, more infectious than the current strain of COVID is. And so I want us to spend some time, I'll stop talking here in just a moment,
That's okay. This is great.
some time to kind of look at some of those older diseases, and then maybe talk some as well about some emerging infections that I don't think will be the next pandemic, but we should always be aware of, because from the beginning of the time that there were human beings, there have been, even before that, there have been viruses and bacteria that infect and cause disease in human beings. That's not going away. We might wish it away. We might say we never want to do that again. I'm with you. But wishful thinking is not preparation, and we need to be prepared.
Yeah, that's interesting. You led me to just one out of the box question, but had we not gotten a vaccine, what do you think? How would it have played out?
A lot more millions of people would have died.
Would it eventually have just?
It would have eventually burned through.
Yeah.
But I think, what did we lose? 2 million adult Americans, something like that.
Right.
The models showed that 6 million would have died. And if you think about it, more Americans died after the availability of vaccines than before, because
I didn't know that.
Because there was not the kind of uptake that we needed across all of our society, all of our country. But eventually, it was such an infectious infectious virus that spread from person to person so easily. Eventually, we would have gotten to very high levels of community immunity, herd immunity, they call it. But we would have done so with much greater damage, collateral damage, than even we experienced with that horrible pandemic.
And I guess, do you remember the numbers? Of course, in 1917, that was a totally different story. We had a lot lower population. But do you remember what those numbers were about population?
I don't. But the interesting thing, there were a lot of differences between 1917 and 2019, 2020. and some of the ways that we initially prepared for the 2019 pandemic as we were moving into 2020 was, I think now with 2020 hindsight, recognized as sort of fighting the last battle.
Okay.
That's always you structure things based on what you think will happen,
Sure,
and you
of
think
course.
what's going to happen based on prior experience. And in 1917, 18, 19, in those years, with the pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, the people that were most affected were young adults. And that's part of the reason that World War I came to an end, is a lot of fighting age young men died of flu.
Wow. And it spread, didn't it, in the trenches?
It did.
In the war, I thought
It
so.
did.
Yeah.
And so it had a global impact, a historical impact.
Yeah.
And a lot of what they died of, it turned out, was some of it was the flu, but some of it was pneumococcal pneummonia. That flu damaged their lungs, and then that allowed the pneumococcus, the bacteria, to grow in the lungs, and they died of bacterial pneumonia.
Okay.
And so very, very early in the, if you go to the 2009-2010 pandemic, the H1N1 pandemic, we focused on pneumococcal vaccination, thinking that would help blunt some of the deaths from that pandemic. So we were already, looking backwards, looking at earlier flu experiences. In 2020, when the coronavirus was circulating, or it's still circulating, but when it was first circulating, we assumed it would do the same kind of things, that it would behave the same kind of way as influenza does. And that's the reason we shut down schools, because flu circulates in schools, and schools are the source of community spread with influenza. And so we said, well, this is a respiratory virus. It's going to probably behave like influenza. It turns out that was not fully correct. It was obviously doing much more damage to very old people, and also immunocompromised people and pregnant women. It did relatively less damage, although a lot of children still died. It definitely did less damage in children. So I think for example, the closing of schools, that was a very reasonable thing to do. I think, again, trying to learn from what we did right and what we didn't do right, what we did wrong. I think we could have done a better job of opening schools back up more quickly, because it was relatively early recognized that this was not hitting children the same way that it was hitting adults. It was hard for many of us to comprehend that, to believe it, but that's what the data were showing us.
But at the same time, okay, like you said, didn't hit children as hard. But then if we hadn't closed the schools, then children could have brought it home, and mom and dad, maybe grandparents could have gotten it. It seemed.
Well, that was certainly the rationale for it.
Would that have been the case, do you think?
I think that children contributed to the spread, but I think this virus was so ubiquitous, or becoming so ubiquitous, maybe is a better way to say it, that I would not have advocated, in March of 2020 and April and May, I would not have advocated. Even now, I wouldn't advocate for opening schools. By the time we got to the fall of 2020, and then we had the vaccines being rolled out December of 2020, we're in a different place, and with a lot more knowledge. So that's where I think we have potential to learn from that.
Okay. Now, I know I got you off track a little bit. You were talking about some of the older pre-pandemic infectious diseases that are unfortunately making a resurgence.
I don't know how old your viewers are. I'm 61, so I remember these diseases. And if you're younger than that, and you might not remember them, you'll just all you need to do is ask your parents or grandparents, and they will. Measles, chickenpox, pertussis. Those are the ones that I am watching, and many of us in the pediatric infectious disease space are watching most closely. Measles is the most infectious virus there is. It will, to use that terminology I referred to before, R naught, how many people who, from every one person infected, how many people will become infected? The R naught for measles is 12. For COVID-19, in the very early part of the pandemic, when nobody had any immunity at all, it was in the 10 to 12 range. So it is a little bit more, but it's comparable to what we all experienced with how super spreader events and things like that with COVID happened. Measles will, unlike COVID, which is, well, it's hard because our definitions of respiratory spread versus droplet spread, that is evolving as well based on what we learned with the pandemic. Measles is definitely spread through the air. And it will hang in the air for up to 2 hours. So if I have measles right now, we're sitting in this studio, and I'm, you can become infectious with measles or spread it to others before you become symptomatic yourself. If I'm asymptomatically shedding it right now, it will hang in this room for up to 2 hours. So we leave and the next guests come in an hour and a half later, they can still get measles from me, even though I'm long gone by that point.
Okay.
It's like a heat-seeking missile. It will find the people that are not immune.
And so, do you know how much it's expanded since post-COVID?
Yeah, it's.
I'm sorry. Was it basically gone prior?
It was. Yes.
Okay.
Not throughout the world. But it was. It was not. It was always a fear that it would be re-imported. You may remember I think it was 2014 out in Disneyland. There were some more cases in 2018, 2019. There have been a smattering of cases here and there, mostly or really much all imported cases because you're infectious for 4 days before you become symptomatic, and then for 4 additional days after you become symptomatic. And so, literally with air travel anywhere in the world, you can get somewhere else. You can get here to Birmingham within 18 hours. So at any moment in time, even when it was not seen at all, it still was only 18 hours away.
Especially when you just explain how infectious it is.
Correct.
I'm actually surprised with travelers from other country that it didn't spread a little bit more.
Well,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
It would come in, and the reason it wouldn't catch, the reason it wouldn't start to spread within a community is because of the people in the community who were vaccinated against measles. And you need to have effectively 95% is where the estimates are. 95% or more of a population immune to measles, so that if it comes in, there's no one there to. There's no. If you light the match and put it on the ember on the little the little embers and everything, and you try to blow on it, there's no one around that where it'll catch.
Right.
So where we've seen that post-pandemic damage done is people had unscientific views of the COVID vaccine. They thought it did things it doesn't do in terms of side effects, and they sort of extrapolated that to things like the measles vaccine, which is a very, very effective and very safe vaccine.
So I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I shouldn't because you're. But so it sounds like there are parents who are not getting their kids the measles vaccine, which is surprising me because most school systems require it.
Yes. There's a lot of homeschooling now. I'm not saying this is all from homeschoolers.
Yeah, but I didn't think of that.
Because there are a lot of homeschoolers that are fully vaccinated.
Yeah, of course.
But the reason it's required in schools is because legislatures require that it be required in schools. There are laws.
I didn't know that.
And the challenges to the legal system increasingly are to loosen those requirements, not to maintain or certainly not to strengthen. It wasn't that long ago that there was actually, in the pre-pandemic period, there were some movements towards strengthening those laws in some of the with not allowing personal belief exemptions, for example, religious exemptions. There is no major religion in the world that actually says don't get vaccinated.
Right.
Religious exemptions many times are code for I don't want to get it, so my religion says I don't have to, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the Pope says to get it, the imams say to get it, the rabbis say to get it, non-Catholic Christian churches say to get it. I mean, this is I can live on my own. I don't need anybody telling me what to do kind of things is the reason people resist it.
Yeah, and that was a big thing during the COVID vaccine. All the people who were against the vaccine, that's usually the attitude I heard. Nobody can tell me what to do. Are you finding, and I don't know if there's anybody's done numbers on this, so I understand 95% is kind of the threshold. Is there any kind of information as to how many people are not getting their kids vaccinated?
There are data.
Okay.
There are data with that, and if you look at statewide levels in Alabama, I think we're below 95, but we're not too far below. I mean, Alabama historically does quite well with vaccination rates.
Okay.
The challenge, though, is that those are statewide or countywide kind of data. There was a polio case in New York City a few years back, 2022 maybe or something like that, and it was in a literally a neighborhood in New York City where the vaccination rates, in this case against polio, were lower. So you can have neighbor. I mean, people tend to live around people who think like they do, and so if you're in a neighborhood of I'm making this up, an 8-block region, and in some of those situations, and we have these communities in Alabama, the vaccination rates against measles will be in the 60% range.
Oh boy.
And so what that means is that the 40%, to use that as the example number, the 40% that say, hey, you can't tell me what to do, you can't tell me what to do with my child, they're putting the 60% at risk because when you if you have 2 doses of measles vaccine, you're protected, but it still can spread within a community, and the more it spreads, the more it spreads. So it's up to us to all do our part. This is, in my judgment, this is different. Any kind of infectious disease, a highly communicable infectious disease, is a different argument than the personal liberty argument that did, coming out of the pandemic, kind of predominate. Now, I've got to admit, it's still predominating right now. The difference, though, is if I have hypertension and I don't take my antihypertensive meds and I stroke out or die, I'm the one who pays that price.
You're not affecting anybody else.
And my family, that kind of thing,
but
not like what we're talking about. Whereas if I don't get my vaccines and I get infected myself, certainly I'm doing myself damage, but I'm putting other people at risk as well.
Right.
This just inherently is a community issue. And at least coming out of the pandemic, I think everybody's just so tired, understandably tired, that argument, nobody want to talk about it anymore. And for right now, maybe we have some time where we don't have to talk about it further, but measles is resurfacing, chickenpox is resurfacing, pertussis is definitely resurfacing, and I've seen all of those, and I've seen children die from all of those, and we don't want that.
Right, of course. That's terrible. And you mentioned new infectious diseases emerging.
Yes, yeah, they don't ever go away. The newest one you may have heard about is Oropouche.
No,
it's a mosquito-borne virus that is spread in South America for some time and through the Caribbean, and it's increasingly being seen north in the northern part of the Caribbean. There have been cases that have been imported from Cuba and other kind of northern Caribbean islands into the U.S. And right now anyway, it's not, that we know of anyway, it's not circulating in the mosquitoes here. These are travelers that return from those or come into the United States from those countries. But with the climate change issues and differing species of mosquitoes in differing parts of the country and differing weather patterns in terms of dry versus wet, I think we are likely to see some of these mosquito-borne infections like dengue, which has had cases in Florida and in Texas, and used to be rather endemic in the southern part of the U.S., but it had gotten away because of mosquito control measures. I think that those can come back, and Oropouche would be an example of that. Eastern equine encephalitis is another one, which has been around for a long time, and there's a dozen deaths or so on some of the bad years, but listeners may have been hearing of cases up in, I think, Massachusetts, where they were doing some community control measures to try to bring down mosquito populations because Eastern equine is circulating there, and we certainly have that in Alabama as well.
And the three you mentioned, Oropouche, Eastern equine, and dengue, How serious is this? What are the symptoms and how likelihood is fatality?
Well, I'll add another to that then,
Okay.
if we want to talk about sort of the likelihood of getting it. West Nile virus.
Oh, yeah.
That probably is the one that's the most, for right now anyway, in the United States, where there's the highest risk. And it's been that way since the early 2000s. But it's the most of the arboviruses, the arbovirus-borne viruses. That means, mosquito-borne.
Okay.
It is the one that is the most widely spread.
Okay.
And I mean, people die of that each year. It can cause you can be asymptomatically infected. You can have fever and body aches. You can have meningitis, and you can have death. And the asymptomatics, the broadest base, like a pyramid, broadest base, and then the kind of systemic illness, central nervous system illness, death.
Okay.
That kind of a decreasing frequency, but obviously increasing severity.
Yeah.
It can't get much more severe than dying. So West Nile would be one that really I do think we have to be mindful of, no matter where we live in the United States. Eastern equine, I think, will be popping up from place to place, but the CDC does a really good job of monitoring for it, and state health departments do too. So, you can get a sense of where these things are from that. Dengue is right now really more of an imported risk. And I guess Oropouche is too, although we don't really have as much experience with that one yet here in the United States. My suspicion is that Oropouche will end up being more like Zika was back in 2016, when it caused a lot of damage in Brazil, especially with a lot of congenital infections, babies whose brains were destroyed when they were literally destroyed when they were in utero.
Okay.
So I think that probably that's what Oropouche will end up being more like. But the key here is, with all four of those, is that it's mosquito borne. And so what you can do to protect yourself is to put mosquito repellent on, and just have that be part of your routine. You can do sprays. You can buy those little wipes that are kind of impregnated with off or whatever it is, and you write those on wear long sleeves. Try not to go out at dusk or at dawn, when the mosquitoes that like to bite and carry these viruses are circulating the most widely. Try to find, if you've got old sources of water, like tires that can collect water in them, or big dog bowls outside or something like that, try to empty those so that the mosquitoes don't have a place to come and try to get water and breed and so forth. So really it's just kind of common sense, and again, I think it's where we have done a good job coming out of the pandemic. We didn't like it, but we are very aware of infections and how they spread. Just be mindful of that and take it seriously, but don't live in fear. I mean, it's not something where you should only be inside and never go outside, those kinds of things. Live your life, but live your life wisely.
And the mosquito-borne diseases, I assume those kind of die down in the winter then? Would that be correct?
Yes, although again, climate change is shifting some of those patterns, and we don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but almost certainly there's just going to be more of them.
Exactly. Several years ago, I interviewed a UAB doctor who told me the same, that things like dengue fever were coming north because of climate change. Do you see, 10, 12 years down the road, something like that really spreading, becoming a real problem?
I hope not.
Yeah.
I think that dengue and, let's stay with dengue. I think it's not likely to become a widespread problem in the U.S. for a couple of reasons. One is air conditioning and screens over windows. And the other is mosquito. We're a rich country. We can afford, mosquito depopulation efforts.
Okay.
Now you always have the risk of, if you use chemicals to do that, what are the environmental and human risks from that? I mean, this is a tension here that we got to have these conversations. But I think we have resources available to us that many other parts of the world are not fortunate enough to have.
Okay.
So I doubt it.
Okay.
But there's so many travelers coming back in. You go on vacation and you say, hey, let's go to Rio, or let's go to Lima, or wherever you may want to. It's kind of an exciting place to go. And you get infected with chikungunya, or you get infected with these weird exotic sounding viruses, and they can do a lot of injury.
Okay. Well, are there any parting words for our viewers, both healthcare professionals and folks who are in other businesses and lines of work.
Live life. Don't run scared, but also be smart. Vaccines save lives, but they don't save lives by sitting on a shelf. They save lives by being administered to people and generating immune responses in those people that protect them if they're ever exposed to the pathogen that's the vaccine is protecting against.
Okay.
And so, politely, but persistently, tell people that you think vaccines are a good thing. And because the people that listen to these podcasts, they're going to be influencers, if you will. I don't looking over at a younger guy here in the room, probably not using that word quite right, but you can make a difference.
Okay.
And I think that's what God puts us here to do is not to berate people, not to harass them, but to tell people what we think is the right thing to do in a polite Southern way. And I think we can do that. We can make a difference in this world by doing that. And same when it comes to just common sense measures like mosquito repellent, for example. Right.
Well, great. I really appreciate your time and all the information.
I appreciate, Steve, the opportunity to be with you today.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.